There is a pattern in history, a silent sequence that has ended every great empire long before its people realized what was happening. 3 times in the last 500 years, a superpower rose to global dominance, reshaped the world, and then collapsed with startling speed. And here in 2025, the United States is moving through that same pattern step by step, as if following a script written centuries ago. In 1590, Spain was the wealthiest empire on earth. Its galleons carried half the world's silver. Its armies ruled continents. Its currency powered global trade. 80 years later, the empire was bankrupt, reduced to a shadow of its former glory. In 1914, Britain governed the largest empire in human history. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. 40 years later, the empire was gone, the currency shattered, and Britain relegated to America's junior partner. And in 1991, the Soviet Union commanded nuclear arsenals, global influence, and ideological power. Then, in just 900 days, it disappeared without a war, without an invasion, collapsed entirely from within. And here is the part no one wants to say out loud. The United States has already completed 5 of the 7 stages in that same historical sequence. We are not approaching the pattern. We are already deep inside it. Before we break down the stages, you must understand what imperial collapse actually looks like. Not in theory, in practice. It does not begin with enemies at the gates. It begins with exhaustion, with commitments too large to sustain, debts too heavy to carry, and institutions too brittle to reform. On the surface, everything still appears stable. The currency still works. The government still speaks with confidence. The military still projects power. But beneath that calm surface, the structure is already cracking. And once the cracks spread far enough, the fall comes suddenly. So let's start at the beginning with the first empire to walk this path: Spain. If the historical sequence of imperial collapse is the script, then Spain was the original performance, the empire that showed future nations exactly how a civilization can possess unimaginable wealth and still engineer its own downfall. What happened to Spain is not merely a chapter in European history. It is a blueprint written in silver and sealed in bankruptcy. After the conquest of the Americas, Spain controlled the richest mines ever discovered. Silver flowed across the Atlantic in quantities the world had never seen, 200 tons a year, then 400. The Spanish real became the first global reserve currency, accepted in every port from Antwerp to Manila. To the monarchs in Madrid, this looked like infinite power, infinite resources, infinite destiny. But the pattern had already begun. Wealth blinded the empire to its vulnerabilities. Imperial ambition pushed Spain into war on 4 continents at once, fighting the Ottomans, battling France, suppressing rebellion in the Netherlands, contesting England at sea, and expanding across Asia and the Americas. Maintaining this vast military apparatus consumed half of all royal revenue, and still it was not enough. So Spain did what every overstretched empire does: first they borrowed, then they debased. Silver coins were mixed with copper, then with more copper, until the currency was currency in name only. Inflation erupted, merchants rebelled, and foreign lenders tightened their terms. Yet the deeper collapse came from within. Spain became a country that consumed everything but produced almost nothing. Why build ships when you can buy them with silver? Why invest in manufacturing when you can import finished goods? Gold and silver were supposed to make Spain rich. Instead, they made Spain dependent. When silver production finally declined, the entire imperial economy imploded. 4 state bankruptcies followed in just a few decades, and the social fabric tore as skilled citizens fled and poverty surged. By 1700, Spain still ruled vast territory on maps, but hollowed out, stagnant, and powerless. And in its fall, it left a warning carved into history. No empire, no matter how wealthy, survives after it sacrifices production for illusion. If Spain revealed how overwhelming wealth can hollow out an empire from within, Britain demonstrated the second great truth of the pattern. Even the largest empire on earth cannot outspend the limits of its own economy. Spain collapsed under the weight of silver. Britain collapsed under the weight of responsibility. And just as Spain once believed its mines would last forever, Britain believed its navy, its colonies, and its currency placed it above the laws of decline. They were wrong. At its peak, the British Empire stretched across every time zone. A quarter of the world's landmass, hundreds of millions of subjects, and a navy so powerful that no rival dared challenge it openly. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, the backbone of global trade. and London was the unquestioned financial capital of the planet. But beneath the grandeur, the familiar pattern was already forming. The empire's obligations defending India, garrisoning Africa, controlling the Middle East, policing China, and managing far-flung colonies, demanded resources that no economy could sustain indefinitely. World War I accelerated everything. Britain chose to enter a war it could have stayed out of, and in doing so, it mortgaged the future of the empire. Gold reserves evaporated. Debt soared. For the first time in centuries, Britain became a debtor to the United States. Victory in war disguised defeat in finance. And when Britain returned to the gold standard at pre-war parity in 1925, it locked itself into an overvalued currency that suffocated domestic industry. Unemployment surged, exports collapsed, and by 1931 the pound was forced off gold, shattering global confidence in sterling. Then came World War II, a conflict that finished what World War I had begun. Britain won militarily but lost economically. By 1945, it owed more than its annual GDP and no longer had the means to maintain its empire. India slipped away first, then Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Within one generation, the greatest imperial structure in human history evaporated. By the 1972, the pound was no longer global but merely local, and Britain a secondary power. Another empire had followed the pattern, proof that military glory, colonial reach, and financial prestige cannot save a nation once economic gravity takes hold. If Britain proved that even global dominance cannot outrun fiscal limits, the Soviet Union revealed the next evolution of the pattern. A superpower can rival the world militarily and still collapse from within if its economic foundation is fundamentally unsound. Where Spain drowned in silver and Britain in debt, the USSR drowned in its own contradictions. The pattern continued: different empire, different century, same trajectory toward the same destination. After World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as one of only two global superpowers. It wielded vast armies, controlled Eastern Europe, built an arsenal of thousands of nuclear weapons, and expanded its influence into Asia, Africa, and Latin America. To the world, it appeared unstoppable, but beneath the steel, concrete, and propaganda, the Soviet economy was fragile. The USSR sought military parity with the United States, without possessing anything close to America's productive capacity. Matching a richer rival meant absorbing a crushing economic cost, up to 20% of GDP diverted into tanks, missiles, and soldiers. That burden would eventually break the system. Central planning suffocated innovation. Factories produced quantity but not quality. Farms failed despite immense natural resources. Technology lagged further behind each decade. Oil exports masked the rot, allowing the government to fund imports and hide inefficiencies. But when oil prices dropped in the 1980s, the mask fell away. Suddenly, the USSR could no longer afford to buy grain, maintain its satellites, or project power abroad. The ruble, never trusted, never freely traded, collapsed in all but name, forcing the state to rely on dwindling gold reserves for foreign purchases. Then the geopolitical scaffolding began to crack. Eastern Europe broke away one nation at a time. Moscow watched as its empire dissolved, but lacked both the economic strength and ideological legitimacy to stop it. And once the unraveling began, it moved with historic speed. From the moment the Berlin Wall fell, to the day the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin passed only 900 days. The Soviet collapse proves the brutal logic of the pattern. Military might cannot compensate for economic decay. When productivity collapses and currency confidence evaporates, even a nuclear superpower can disappear almost overnight. And this is where the pattern stops being history and becomes the present. Spain revealed the dangers of unearned wealth, Britain exposed the limits of global obligations, and the Soviet Union demonstrated how military power cannot compensate for economic fragility. Each collapse felt unique to the people living through it, yet in hindsight, each was simply another iteration of the same script. And today, the United States is following that script more precisely than any empire before it. Not approaching it, not flirting with it, moving through it, step by step, stage by stage. The first stage, military overextension, is undeniable. No empire in history has maintained a global footprint as vast as America's. 750 military bases, alliances spanning Europe and Asia, and security commitments that no modern economy can finance indefinitely. Like Britain before World War I, America's strategic promises exceed its material capacity. The second stage, currency debasement, accelerated after 1971 when the dollar was severed from gold. Since 2000, the money supply has expanded by hundreds of percent far faster than economic output, mirroring the same monetary distortion that destroyed Spain's silver-based currency and Britain's gold-backed pound. The third stage, debt spiral, is now structural, with federal debt exceeding $36 trillion and interest payments rivaling the defense budget. The United States borrows not to grow, but to survive. This is the mathematical point every empire reaches when decline becomes self-funding. The fourth stage, loss of productive capacity, has hollowed out the industrial base. America imports its pharmaceuticals, electronics, steel, machinery, even components for its own military. Like Spain, it consumes wealth generated elsewhere and exports its currency in exchange. The fifth stage is the most visible. Social decay. Trust is collapsing. Crime persists. Addiction ravages entire regions. Fertility declines. Politics fractures into paralysis. These are not symptoms of a healthy superpower. They are the unmistakable markers of an empire deep into decline. These 5 completed stages match Spain, match Britain, match the USSR. The unsettling conclusion is clear. The United States is not drifting toward danger. It is already deep inside the historical pattern that has ended every empire before it. If the first 5 stages of decline describe the slow erosion of a superpower's foundations, the 6th stage marks the moment when erosion turns into fracture. Spain's silver lost credibility. Britain's pound lost convertibility. The Soviet Union never had a trusted currency to begin with. And now, after decades of monetary expansion and soaring debt, the United States approaches the same inflection point. The dollar's dominance, long assumed to be permanent, is no longer unquestioned. It is being tested, quietly at first, but unmistakably. For nearly a century, the world's appetite for U.S. dollars acted as America's hidden superpower. Nations held dollars in reserves, traded commodities in dollars, borrowed in dollars, and settled international payments through the American banking system. This global demand allowed the United States to run deficits without consequence, print money without immediate inflation, and fund a worldwide military presence at little real cost. It was not just an economic advantage, it was the foundation of American geopolitical power. But the winds have shifted. Major economies, China, Russia, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, are increasingly settling trade in their own currencies. BRICS nations are openly discussing alternatives to the dollar-dominated system. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace in half a century. Even America's closest allies are diversifying their reserves. The dollar remains dominant, but dominance is not immunity. The same trend lines that preceded Britain's collapse as the world's financial center are now forming again, and the danger is not gradual decline, it is sudden reversal. If global demand for dollars falls, those dollars come home, trillions of them, flooding American markets, devaluing the currency, igniting inflation, and destabilizing debt markets, already stretched to the breaking point. The privilege of borrowing cheaply would vanish. Interest payments would explode. The fiscal structure of the United States, built entirely on the assumption of dollar supremacy, would begin to crack. History is clear. Reserve currencies do not fade softly. They fall abruptly when confidence breaks, and confidence breaks all at once. Should the dollar move meaningfully into Stage 6, the United States would shift from chronic imbalance to acute crisis, exactly where past empires found themselves just before the final stage. If Stage 6 marks the beginning of global doubt, Stage 7 is where doubt becomes reality. And this is the darkest truth the pattern reveals. Empires do not die the way they live. They do not fade gently, nor do they decline evenly. They fracture, they snap. They collapse with a speed that shocks even those who sense the decline but believe the timeline would stretch decades further. Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union all illustrate this violent rhythm, the slow decay of institutions followed by the sudden failure of the system that once held them together. Spain spent a century bleeding silver and staggering through crisis after crisis. Yet its decisive collapse came almost overnight when the mind slowed and creditors lost patience. Britain controlled 1/4 of the earth in 1914 and stood effectively empireless by 1970, a single human lifetime. The Soviet Union maintained nuclear parity with the United States one year and ceased to exist the next. These collapses were not anomalies. They were the moment when long-ignored structural weaknesses converged into a single breaking point. And the same dynamics would apply to the United States. Once confidence in the dollar meaningfully erodes, the entire financial architecture begins to shake. A currency crisis would raise interest rates. Higher interest rates would make refinancing government debt impossible. An inability to refinance debt would paralyze Washington. Political gridlock would collide with fiscal crisis. Social tensions already rising would flare. Military commitments abroad would become unsustainable. The collapse would not come from a foreign invasion, but from economic physics. Internal contradictions reaching critical mass. The most dangerous element is the illusion of normalcy. Institutions still function. Markets still open. The military still deploys. The currency still circulates. Until, suddenly, they don't. The Soviet Union looked stable until the exact moment it wasn't. Britain looked dominant until the pound broke. Spain looked wealthy until the silver tunnel ran dry. The pattern teaches one final lesson. Empires rise gradually, but they fall all at once. Collapse is not a future event. It is the final acceleration of forces that have been building quietly for decades, unnoticed, until they become unstoppable. And this is where the pattern turns from analysis into warning. After watching Spain waste its silver, Britain exhaust its empire, and the Soviet Union implode under the weight of its own contradictions, one truth becomes unmistakable. Every superpower believes it is the exception right up until the moment it collapses. The United States is no different. Like every empire before it, America tells itself that its institutions are stronger, its economy more resilient, its currency more indispensable, and its people more adaptable. Yet, history shows that confidence is always highest just before the fall. The belief in exceptionalism is not a shield, it is part of the pattern. The closing message is stark. The forces pulling the United States toward collapse are not ideological or cultural, they are mathematical. Empires that overspend, overextend, debase their currency, hollow out production, and fracture socially do not stabilize with time, they accelerate toward the end. That acceleration is visible now. Since 2020, debt has exploded, political fragmentation has deepened, military commitments have multiplied, and the monetary system has stretched beyond historical precedent. These are not the warning signs of a system that might enter decline, they are the hallmarks of one already moving through it. Yet, like all stories of collapse, there remains a narrow window of possibility. The United States could reform where Spain refused, adapt where Britain hesitated, innovate where the USSR stagnated. But the narrative does not pretend that such reinvention is likely. The weight of precedent is overwhelming. History has already written the script. Nations fall not because they lack warnings, but because they ignore them. And so the text ends with a call not to despair, but to awareness. When stages 6 and 7 arrive, they will not announce themselves slowly. They will strike like they struck every empire before America. The purpose of understanding the pattern is simple. To recognize what is coming before the world realizes it has already begun. Because once the collapse accelerates, the time for preparation will be gone, and the superpower that believed it was different will learn the final lesson of history. The pattern does not break for anyone. If this story challenged the way you see history and the present, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if you found real value in this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter as this pattern continues to unfold.